That is why so serious. I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this review for February 2nd, 2023. I am JD Duran.
And I am Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. This is the first of our reviews within this new structure, this new format that we're doing. And just to reiterate, because it is the first, maybe you haven't heard what we're doing. Obviously, within the old structure, we would lead off every episode, every main show podcast with a review. Of course, Ryan and Jay on Extra Film had a couple of reviews that define what those shows were all about. That is not what we're doing here with the new structure, with the new main show. Ryan and Jay joining us as we did on episode 519. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the new format and the new structure. Certainly would love to hear everyone's feedback on that.
The ugly faces associated with it.
Hey, that's certainly a part of it. And, you know, part of the structure, part of making sure that every episode isn't 73 hours long, we are removing the reviews to these isolated episodes.
Yeah.
So anyone that wants to hear our review on, let's say, Close, nominated for an Oscar, they can find this episode isolated. It's easily searchable. It's not going to be bogged down by any other content. So we decided, hey, let's do it that way instead.
Yeah, it can be kind of a double-edged sword the more we think about it, though, because that means potentially, depending on how busy and stacked a certain movie weekend could be, and maybe we might be in the middle of a movie series, we still plan on doing those every now and then, too.
Yep. Uh-huh.
That could mean maybe 7 episodes a week,
maybe.
depending on...
It very well could, yeah.
Yeah, but they're easily manageable. They're easier for us to put together, and it's going to be easier for all of you to find those isolated, as JD is talking about. So I feel like everyone wins. It might look like more content, but it's easier to find.
It'll even out. It's easier to find because, again, this episode is going to live by itself. So Brendan and I, we're going to review Close here, and then guess what? That's it. It's all done. There's not 90 other minutes of content.
This is such a weird feeling, man.
I know.
I know we're starting this out. We're going to look back on this episode maybe in like 3 years and think about how much we kept talking about the old format. Because we're so used to doing a main review, have another major segment, maybe another review, and all of a sudden that leads to a 3-hour episode. And here, I mean, I don't know how long this will end up being. The final timestamp will tell us that, but this will probably be under an hour. It's going to feel so weird.
It is going to be very strange, but you know, it's not only going to be easier for listeners, viewers to find these episodes, it's going to be more digestible. It'll be easier on our lives in the end. It as will. Well.
Man, if we could only take time and explain the technicalities of all of this, for those of you listening who have your own podcast and your own editing formats, the way we talk about this, you might think I have to jump on this bandwagon too. It's a lifesaver for JD over here for sure. For how much time you spent editing.
Yeah, I won't get into the details, but every episode in the old format, from prep work to recording the show to editing, was anywhere between 15 and 20 hours an episode.
Yeah.
It was, and you do that for 10 years. We did that for 10 years, and that was just you and I on the main show. Then there's Extra Film that I was editing, Women in Session now.
And it's so incredible. You know, we're adding a video component to this. People might think, man, they jumped the gun. They've promoted themselves. They're on the tip of the iceberg now. That's a lot more work. It's actually not.
It's not. No, it's much less work. Ironically, this is much, much easier for me. So it's very exciting. And that leads us to what is going to be our first review of many doing it this way. And Brendan and I are kicking things off here as we talk about the Belgian film Close. This is directed by Lukas Dhont, and it stars Eden Dambrine, Gustav de Waele, Emily de Keen, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. And forgive me for butchering those names. I'm sure that I did. but certainly
we
did
tried
my best.
looking it up. We tried getting an honest and accurate, representation of how these names are pronounced. We couldn't find as much in the short span of time prepping for this episode, so we tried to give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, and as we noted, I believe we mentioned this, as many of you know, this film was nominated at the Academy Awards for Best International Film. We didn't really talk about this too much at the In Session Film Awards. I did have this under my individual special awards. I had Eden Dambrine as a nominee for me there. So it did get a mention, but aside from that, I don't think it was mentioned any other time.
I'm trying to recall, because I know I considered Eden Dambrine as one of my 5 for best leading actor, regardless of child performances or whatever. I don't, we did that award show only a few weeks to not even a month ago, I guess, at this point. I don't even remember.
Like 3 weeks ago now? Yeah, something like that.
I don't remember who I nominated for what categories.
I know. It's a blur.
Well, I remember I did nominate Eden Dambrine for Best Actor, but I know I was at least considering him.
Yeah. Very, very good performance, and we'll certainly get into that here. So I guess with all of that laid out, Brennan, let's go ahead and jump into it. What did you think about Close?
Well, I think that's enough of an illusion, what I said there about Eden Dambrine and what you were saying about him there, that we're going to have mostly positive things to say about this movie, just given how good his performance is. And we will talk about that for probably the largest majority of this episode. I will say I like this movie. I don't love it. And I'm kind of having a hard time pinpointing exactly why this film didn't absolutely destroy me. Because I'm such a proponent for movies like this, movies and television like this, that depict open young male love without the necessity of labels. A great example being Pixar's underrated masterpiece, Luca. Yes, I call it a masterpiece. Movie. I think that is one of Pixar's best movies. And that's a movie that depicts young male love in a very, it's an ambiguous way, but if you choose to look at that movie as strictly platonic, you can. And that's something we don't see very often. We joke about this, JD. We get on these calls, these podcasts all the time, and I feel like we have love for each other. We're able to openly admit that. That's a very strong and positive thing. We don't see that all that often in movies, and I love when we do. That kind of notion is written all over this movie Close. And of course, we have that great performance by Eden Dambrine leading that. So there's a lot about this movie that really should have 100% worked for me. This should have been one of my favorite movies of the year. If I had to take a guess why that I didn't fall head over heels for it, I think it might come down to the central friendship between Leo and Remy, which, for a little context, we didn't really talk about much of what this film is about. It does depict a friendship between 2 young boys that is sort of mocked by their classmates as being a little bit too close, we'll simply say. And then at about maybe the halfway point, there's a major turning point in this movie that changes the entire trajectory of the story. It's a tragedy of sorts. I'll leave it at that. And it's a very daring approach to have a narrative like this. But I think this central friendship between Leo and Remy might be a little too underdeveloped to, I guess, justify that early of a major development in this plot. I mean, like I said, there's no big secret here that a big event occurs around this time. I think it should have happened a little bit later. I think it happens too soon in this movie. And I won't say too much because I don't want to give too much away. I want to leave that a little bit open for those who don't know what this movie is or what it's going to depict, because not knowing that does help. It does help make this movie work for a lot of people. And I kind of want to leave it at that. But I think there are narrative choices that don't fully work. I think it leaves a little bit of room, or it leaves too much room for this friendship to develop in the way that I think it needed to. But that said, I think from a performative standpoint, there are a lot of great things here. Eden Dambrine's great. If it weren't for his performance, I'm not sure what I'd be saying about this movie. As far as child actors go, he's one of the best in the past, like 5 or 6 years, maybe. It really is up there. He has to lead this whole thing and say very little. So I think in that regard, it's very good. And I do think the film is very good. I'm not in love with it in the way that I wish I was, given what it's depicting.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. It sounds like I am higher on this film than you are. I really liked it a lot. I do want to know, before we get into the emotional intricacies of this film, that I was very much moved by in the end, because I know there's a notion floating out there, and I certainly do understand that not everyone is going to respond to this film because of its heaviness, the sorrow that is the DNA of this film. And that's going to weigh on a lot of people. Misery porn is certainly one way that you could classify this film.
I hate that term so much.
I do as well. And look,
there are times it's justified. I don't think it's justified for this movie, but
I agree.
I think this movie has more nuance on its mind.
Well, and I just wanted to bring that up because, generally speaking, the films that people, when they throw that label out, I tend to disregard that most of the time, because life is often full of arduousness.
Yeah.
We experience things fundamentally at our core that are heavy. And I don't think art should avoid that just because it's difficult to depict.
I think there's a way to depict misery that isn't heavy or pornographic, as you want to call it.
Yeah.
And sometimes to call it that way, I think speaks more to the individual saying it and their life experience, as opposed to how the movie handles it. Of course, there are movies that don't handle it very well.
Sure.
But there are more maybe objective reasons for that.
I agree.
I don't think this film falls into misery porn at all.
Yeah, I think if a film that's heavy like this, if it falters, we can have a conversation about why that is the case. You brought up a really great reason as to why it doesn't work for you, and it has nothing to do with its heaviness, but the storytelling of this film. And I think that's fair. That's a conversation that we can certainly have. I struggle, though, to indulge in the conversation regarding that specific label, because, again, I just fundamentally, the ethos of me as a cinephile, I just don't think art should avoid the misery of life, because we all experience it to one degree or another. And for a lot of us, films like this help us articulate our grief in ways that we might not be able to otherwise.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was a big thing for me with this film, because, again, circling back to the In Session Film Awards, not only did I nominate Eden Dambrine for Best Young Performer, which I awarded him the winner of in that category.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, I do remember that.
But I also nominated this film for a category that I simply called Best Movie Not in My Top 20 That Still Resonates Profoundly. And to me, a lot of the reason that I was so drawn to this film is how this young child goes about coping with his grief. I've had heartache in my life as well. I haven't experienced what this young kid experiences, but I've certainly had to deal with grief as well. And his coping mechanism in this film, which I'll just go ahead and throw it out there, he joins this hockey team.
I knew you were going to bring up the hockey. I knew you were going to bring it up.
And I
do
talked
that
about
hockey.
This.
Do that hockey.
I talked about this in the award show too. Like the way he copes with his grief through hockey and the specificities of the sport, which I definitely want to talk about, is something that I can relate with in ways that, again, is hard to articulate. But this film, through its art and through its depiction, it allows me to be cathartic in that way, which, again, is why labels such as misery porn or whatever label you want to throw at a movie, I just find that to be disingenuous discourse.
Sure.
Because the reason films don't work for you often, I think, come down to other things, specific things, storytelling,
comes down to you,
script,
honestly, as opposed to exactly.
Yeah, that's usually often the case. And I think this is a film that again, is taking something that we can all relate with, and it is articulating it in a way that many of us can see and relate with, and certainly feel what these characters are feeling. Now, I do want to echo a little bit of what you were saying, because there is this reveal that takes place, 20, 25 minutes into the film.
It's a little later than that, but it's still pretty early.
It's still pretty early. Is that a little bit too soon? Is the friendship, could the development of that been a little bit more fruitful? I don't necessarily disagree. From a script writing perspective, or maybe from an editing perspective, not sure what was cut or left on the editing room floor. I think the performances save it for me, though, because I don't necessarily disagree, but I really like the performances, and not just Eden Dambrine, who's great. We'll talk more about him, but there's a couple of scenes with Gustav Waele as well that I think is really quite terrific, and I think he helps sell this reveal that is about to take place. So we can certainly get into the nuances of all of that, but
sure.
I do think the way this film goes about tackling the coping process and the coping mechanism of hockey specifically, and these performances and how they tap into all of that with the friendship early on, but in the aftermath of it all as well, I think is very good. Very, very good. When we did the award show, this sat at number 21 for me. So it was just outside my top 20. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, I do agree with you that Gustav Waele, who plays Remy, the main friend here of Leo's, who is the subject of this event that occurs, we'll simply say. I do think his performance is very good. I also love the relationship that he has with his mother, Sophie, played by Emily DeCane. Again, I don't know if we're pronouncing these names right. We hope that we are, but we at least want to acknowledge who they were. So those of you listening, you'll at least know who we're talking about and which performances to look out for here. I love their relationship between mother and child, and maybe selfishly, it just made me wish that Remy was more of a character than, I guess, in some ways a catalyst for Leo's grief. And
That's fair.
And that it does kind of feel that way, which is why I did still sort of question the mechanics of this narrative as to when this big event that we're talking about occurs, and why I think maybe it should have come a little bit later to sort of establish Remy as more of his own individual character rather than just be this cipher of sorts. But I do think that Gustav Waele is very good at tapping into specific things around childhood insecurity and confusion, and the way that this friendship starts to become fragmented and disjointed for reasons that really just relate to high school cliques, honestly, and high school drama. It's very simple. It's not even high school. It's even younger than that. I mean, that's just an example I throw out there as something arbitrary, but the way that this young boy has to sort of comprehend that confusion, I do think is very powerful, which is why selfishly I maybe wish he was just more of a character than that cipher I was talking about.
Sure.
And I think if that were a bit, if that were more developed, I would have loved this movie a lot more, because a lot of the stuff that you're saying, I do agree with. I love the way that this film deals with physical anger as catharsis, and that comes in the form of hockey.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about sports on this podcast, so I know enough to say that this is one of the more accurate hockey movies I think I can remember seeing in the past 10 years. I mean, this actually has more in line with something like Mystery Alaska, which is really more about the genuineness and the accuracy of the sport. Yeah. And if someone were to see this movie and say it's a better hockey movie than a grief movie, I don't know if I would agree with that. Yeah. But I wouldn't necessarily push back too heavily on that.
The two are intricately connected, though.
They are. But if you found one aspect a bit more accurate and powerful than the other, let's say the hockey aspect, I wouldn't necessarily push back too heavily on that, because from a sports movie standpoint, those scenes are very effective, and I do think they have a very appropriate place in this narrative.
Yeah. So I think the choice of hockey, and I don't know if this was deliberate on Lukas Dhont's perspective. I don't know if when they were writing this film, if this was top of mind. My guess is it wasn't, and it's just a coincidence. But the choice
he might
of
be a
hockey,
major Red Wings fan for all we know.
Well, I think the choice of hockey is fascinating in this regard because early on, the relationship between Leo and Remy, the film is very much deconstructing social norms, right? You mentioned how their friendship is being mocked because people think they're too close, even though they are seemingly platonic friends.
Yeah.
But they are mocked because they are not just together all the time, but they are physically close with each other. Yeah. You could label it as even intimate, but perhaps in a platonic way. What's interesting to me about that is that in recent years, the sport of hockey, broadly speaking, has been put under a microscope because of the male toxicity that has been at its nucleus for decades and decades and decades. And people are trying to have the sport be more inclusive to people of color, getting the sport into the inner cities, opening it up to women, opening it up to the LGBTQ community as well.
Yeah.
These are all talking points within the community, but there's a sector of the sport that has struggled with that.
Sure.
And when it comes to accepting people from the outside, so to speak, letting them be a part of the game, there has been a dividing line between the old guard and the new guard in relation to that, to that specifically, to that dichotomy. So again, that alone, I think, is fascinating, including hockey here, because Leo does join the team before this major event that takes place halfway through the film.
Almost as if he has like something to prove, specifically like some type of like masculinity to prove, to hold on to.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm joining this hockey team because it'll prove my bravado. It'll prove my masculinity because it's a sport that is considered to be masculine.
And that could be said about a lot of sports, a lot of professional sports these days that are male dominated, is that there is a machismo to it, whether you want to say it should be there or not. And there is this sort of change in perspective that is slowly happening here. It almost makes me think, like, I would not be surprised if a movie like Close, which depicts young male grief, friendship like this, it could end up being something that's studied in college courses about sports and masculinity. Like it actually could be. There's enough here to dissect in that regard.
It is so fascinatingly appropriate or timely regarding that discourse within the hockey community. And hockey is my favorite sport. So that's the sport that I am most involved with in terms of following and being a part of that discourse. I've seen this a lot over the last few years, and this film taps into it in this fascinating way. Again, was that purposeful on Lukas Dhont's point? I don't know.
I don't know,
but it's still very timely and kind of fascinating to talk about.
The more we talk about it, I'm going to try and look up interviews with Lukas Dhont to see if he had anything to say about why he chose the sport of hockey. It had to have been a deliberate choice. The fact that he is a writer and director here, he obviously made that storytelling choice for a reason. It's not just a sport for some activity's sake. I think he did want to use some type of outlet that is sort of perceived as masculine, as a way for Leo to get that out and convince others that he has that.
Yeah, absolutely. That part I think is 100% deliberate. I don't think we would have to ask him about that. Leo 100% joins that hockey team because he is wanting to depict to everybody else that he can engage.
He can be one of the boys.
Traditional masculinity.
I guess. The question is, was there a reason to choose hockey over any other activity or sport that could have portrayed that?
Given the specific discourse around the sport, broadly speaking, as it relates to that inclusivity of the gay community, of women, other parts of the society that isn't quote unquote, masculine in the traditional sense.
Sure.
So that part might just be accidental, but it certainly makes this film all the more compelling to me.
I agree. I did not expect that we'd have a conversation more about hockey than we would about the movie Close. But I think it is. I think it is
it's
necessary.
Very appropriate. No,
I think it is. Yeah, I think it supports a lot of the reasons that this movie mostly works for both of us. Maybe you more than me, but still works for me regardless.
Well, and that's the thing about the use of it here, because as we noted, Leo joins that team purposefully, trying to subvert the mocking that is happening around him. But then, as you were talking about, the film shifts and it evolves, and the hockey all of a sudden isn't this thing that's trying to mask whatever he's lacking in terms of traditional masculinity, and it becomes a place of catharsis for him.
One of my favorite for him to scream in, basically.
Exactly. One of my favorite scenes of the film. And anyone that's listened to our show for a long time, you certainly know this. I am a huge fan of subtlety. Love subtlety. It's a big reason I love this film
subtlety
in a lot of ways.
And closure. Those are your favorite things in movies.
Yes. Love subtlety. And Eden Dambrine's performance is so good in terms of the subtle nuances he brings to this film. And what I love about the use of hockey, again, tethering it to that, because one of the best scenes of this film is this moment of catharsis, but he's not screaming, he's not yelling, he's not outwardly emotional in a conventional sense, but he is at hockey practice and they are skating side to side, doing conditioning drills as one does.
Sure.
And instead of stopping and just skating the other way, as we know he can do, as his teammates are doing around him, he skates as hard as he can into the boards, causing himself physical pain. And he is doing that intentionally. It is a deliberate choice to harm himself because of the grief and the guilt that he is experiencing, because
that's the other thing too.
Is pointing the finger at himself over what happened. And this is a way for him to punish himself.
I was just going to say, it's very self-inflicting in that regard.
Yes. And again, while my circumstances are certainly a lot different than Leo's, my grief is not what his is, but that idea at its root is something that I can relate with in profound, transcendent ways.
Yeah.
Absolutely can relate with it.
I don't think you need to relate with it in the same way that Leo is, as far as the specifics of what he's dealing with and what he had to go through. But there comes a time in many a child's life when you feel a sense of grief and guilt, and you start to realize that maybe it was your fault. And that's what I think Leo is going through. It's this sense of confusion and not knowing where that regret comes from, but then sort of putting the pieces together and thinking, did I cause this? Am I the catalyst here that led to this terrible event? And I think what this movie does really well, and what Eden Dambrine's performance does really well, is capture that that experience as if that he is experiencing it for the first time.
Yes.
Because that is one of the most painful feelings you can go through as a child, feeling that sense of guilt without ever experiencing it before, when it's unfamiliar to you.
Yeah.
And we get this sense that Leo has never experienced anything like this before. Not just the way that he has lost his friend, but the fact that maybe he was part of the reason why. And that right there is a very devastating notion. I again, going back to the whole misery porn, I guess, topic here, I could see why some people might label it that way, because it is very heavy. But I think this movie captures that hypothetical situation very well. I mean, I've never lost a friend in this way that Leo has, but I've dealt with things in my life where I started to recognize, man, the severe ramifications here are maybe due to something I either said or did. And the level of guilt you feel there, it's when it's new. That's the hardest thing. And I think this film captures that very well.
Well, and even if we can't relate with the specific circumstances, because it sounds like you and I can't relate with the film in that specific way.
Right.
However, we all deal with certain arduous things in our life all the time. How do we go about coping with them? Many of us use sports as an outlet for that catharsis. And for me, I've used hockey countless times, which is why I can relate with this film in that profound way, because hockey has always been an outlet for me. If I'm feeling a certain way and I just need to let that emotion out, I strap on the skates and I go play. That's always been my go-to. And seeing young Leo deal with his grief and his guilt and all of these confused emotions, as you're talking about, that he's likely experiencing for the first time, to throw that out on the ice again in a very subtle way for the most part, because the catharsis comes out in terms of the physicality of performing on the ice, but you look at the actual acting that is underneath the physicality of it, and it is incredibly subtle, which is what I love about the performance.
Practically wordless at
It's
times.
very wordless. He doesn't say anything when he's at hockey practice, and yet he is screaming to the heavens. He's saying so much without verbally saying anything. It all comes through in that outward physicality, throwing himself into the boards. Or there's the scene where he's circling backward and he keeps falling down, and he gets up, very vigorously and skates backwards again and falls down, and almost as if he's falling on purpose, again, deliberately trying to hurt himself in the process. Or you get to the game at the end, which, by the way, I love that he's a lefty. Me too.
I forgot about that. I forgot about that little connection you have with little Leo.
Yeah. So love that. And then in the game, the guy comes barreling down, and what does he do? He gets in the way. He is on a collision course with this other player. Whether it goes well or not, he's putting himself on the line. And again, the ramifications of it and how that comes about, I just find really fascinating. And how hockey, it could be any sport. You can substitute hockey with any sport, and it plays out the same in terms of how Leo uses it as a coping mechanism. Yeah. To me, I just find it personally satisfying, because that's also been my coping process or my coping mechanism a lot in my life. But I just love how it's utilized here.
Well, and I'm glad something like that is here, especially for a movie that's depicting this through the eyes of a child, because a child experiencing it for the first time wouldn't necessarily know how to conjure the words to explain what he or she is going through, which is why a performance like this needs to be wordless. That's sort of the problem with a lot of movies like this that depict childhood trauma, because it's not really the child performance a lot of the times. It's the writer or director trying to verbalize those a bit too literally, to the point that it just doesn't sound authentic from the mindset of a child. And that's what I do love about not just Eden Dambrine's performance, but the fact that his use of screaming, as you're calling it, doesn't evoke screaming at all. It's a loud, wordless performance, which is a weird thing to say. And that's also what I love about Emily DeCane's performance as Sophie, and how they juxtapose each other, because she's the mother of Remy here. She's the adult in this situation. She's the one that kind of needs to be vocal about these things. So as a mother would, sometimes doesn't say the right things, but that's understandable. But the point is, she has more of an understanding of this kind of situation, that she's able to verbalize it, still make mistakes in the process, but that's what juxtaposes young Leo and what he's so confused by. And there is this dichotomy between them, and yet they still seem equally uncertain about how to deal with this, despite one, the adult, being a bit more understanding and recognizing of what this is. So there's a little irony in that too. It's a very layered film from a performance standpoint that I just have to give credit for.
The other irony that I love as well, and this circles back to how hockey is utilized once again, which is so fascinating here. But there's a moment early on where Leo is at practice and Remy comes to visit him, comes to watch him at practice.
Yeah.
He's going to watch his friend at hockey. He's intrigued, genuinely interested. But because Leo is there to separate himself from Remy, to offer up that facade of machismo so people will stop mocking him. And he's embarrassed. He's embarrassed that Remy is there. The other players on his team are mocking him, of course, because his friend is there to watch him. And so what does he do? Leo turns his back. He tries to separate himself as much as he can from
He's thankful for
Remy
that barrier there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Later on in the film, Remy's mother, Sophie, as you're talking about, shows up to the rink to watch Leo at practice. But what is his response this time? He, after practice is over, embraces her presence.
Yeah.
Skates over to her. And they have this incredible moment together that I just think is so fascinating. And again, Don's storytelling,
use of windows. I almost feel kind of symbolic here.
It's so good. It's so good. So I love the storytelling in that regard. And also just circling back to the subtlety of Dambrine's performance and also the overarching narrative as well, because there's this arduous event that takes place. And while with some of the adults, as you're talking about, they do demonstrate outward emotion and grief as a parent would, as any adult in that situation would.
Sure.
However, with Leo, it's often very subtle. It is everything he's doing in this film is internalized until we get to that final scene. And I think the film earns that moment because of how it builds to it in such a methodical way, in such an introspective way, that when we finally do get some outward catharsis from Leo, I think it makes perfect sense. It was the right timing. The film earned it by building to it slowly.
And I think what this film also gets right, and maybe this is credit to Lukas Dhont as a writer and director, just kind of veering away from the film's depiction of grief from a childhood standpoint, is just the way that young boys interact with one another. Because that one scene that you brought up where Remy visits Leo at practice and Leo's a little bit apprehensive, but Remy's intrigued. He wants to reconnect with his friend. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the scene that depicted both of them just before that was sort of this moment of contention between them. And instantly out of nowhere, it's as if one of them just, that doesn't matter anymore. Let's just reconnect, because that happened to me a lot as a child, where you might have a sort of bickering or maybe even a fight with a fellow friend, and there's never any acknowledgement of that. There's never any direct ask for forgiveness or anything. It's just one scene later,
children are.
You all are friends again. And in a way, I kind of like dare I say, a contrivance like that. I actually think it depicts the notion of friendship and young friendship, especially between young males, pretty accurately.
Yeah, I agree, especially given how close they are. And I think that's what I love so much about those early scenes, even though it eventually becomes Leo's movie. But those first 15 or 20 minutes are dedicated to the both of them. I do think there is a duality there until the mockery comes into play and you start to see them separate a little bit and Leo joins the hockey team. Then it starts to become Leo's movie at that point. But I think that duality early on is important in demonstrating how close they are, which is why something like that would happen where, there might be a moment of contention, but you're close with this other person. That contention isn't going to last very long. Even if you don't speak to it as young children, that is often how you I guess, crystallize those situations. You just never talk about it. You just act like it never happened.
You just refuse to acknowledge it. You just let it get, you just leave it by the wayside. That's
until
I did that.
Yeah, I absolutely. I did as well, until it gets to a point where the stakes are perhaps a little bit higher. And this is where I want to talk about Gustav de Waele a little bit as well, because you can forgive little moments of contention, but it gets to a moment where Remy starts to realize there might be something more serious happening here. Like maybe there's a rift in this relationship that I cannot explain. I don't know what's happening necessarily. And how that comes through in de Waele's performance, I think, is really great, because there's that moment in the bedroom where they have this. It starts off as this playful fight, but then by the end of it, both of them start to realize that there's something underneath that is driving a wedge between them, and the fight, the physicality between them becomes forceful. It becomes a little bit rough.
Sure.
And then what we see is, the next morning, they're at breakfast, and there's a great close up on Remy, and he completely succumbs to the moment, just starts weeping there at the table, unwilling to, or maybe not able to articulate to his parents, who are concerned. They ask him, is there, what's wrong? Why are you crying? And he just simply gets up and leave. Like, he can't really explain what's going on. And that moment of performance, that close up, I think is really great. To me, it's things like that save perhaps some of the narrative contrivances, or maybe the underwritten nature of that friendship early on. Moments like that save it for me.
Yeah, you're bringing up a scene that not only might be my favorite scene in the movie, but it's one of those moments where I feel like I need to watch this movie again to get a better sense of Remy as a character, and less so as just a cipher for Leo's grief. Because moments like that, you're absolutely right. There is a real true sense of character to Remy there. Now, this movie is heavy enough that I don't think I'm going to rewatch it again anytime soon.
Sure.
I'm just going to be honest, but
Fair.
I will say, because of scenes like this, I wouldn't be surprised if I end up liking the movie more, because I'm able to dig up those nuances that make me rethink my initial criticisms of Remy as less of a character. I might find him as more of a character that's just less of a physically spoken character, if that makes sense. And that's sometimes the artistry of films. I've had those awakenings with many films in the past, and maybe a movie like Close is just up for that reappraisal for me.
Absolutely. And I think because of those moments, the bond that we see early on, that moment there at breakfast, as we're talking about, another great moment when they're riding their bicycles together. That there is a ghostly presence with Remy throughout that I think helps drive a lot of the grief that we see in the back half of the movie.
And the thing that also helps too, and what really saves a lot of it too, if anything does fall apart in any other director's hands, the friendship is at least believable. Like in the first couple minutes, if you don't buy into this friendship, the movie falls apart even before it has a chance to begin. And that's not the case here. Without any backstory to, I guess, cue us in as to why they're
there's
friends.
no exposition.
There's no exposition, which I really do appreciate. But even the small amount of time that we get with them, I do believe that there is a true friendship there.
I agree.
And maybe that's enough. Maybe that is. Yeah.
And it certainly was for me, even if I do acknowledge that there is credence to the idea that maybe it's a little underwritten, but those performers, man, they make it work. I very much felt that relationship early on, those early scenes when they're, in that little cave and they're playing their games. I just found it so charming and so endearing.
That was very nostalgic for me. I don't know about you, but I've done very literal games just like that before, like reenacting certain action scenes of sorts with some of my fellow friends. Like, we did that all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And even the, as we see more of how intimate they are, it just, it forms that bond in such a palpable way that I just think is great in terms of that Luca-ness, ambiance that is driving a lot of that relationship, which we talked a lot about when we reviewed Luca. I do think that is very much a part of this film in terms of exploring the idea of male friends being able to share that affection in a platonic way without society having to do everything in its power to crush that.
To intervene, yeah.
To intervene. But that's what comes down, and especially when it's at school and, young kids, they don't hold anything back. They're, school is a rough, period in a lot of our lives.
Well, yeah.
And
yeah, I'll just use this as an opportunity to say Pixar's Luca, still top 5 Pixar.
Still great.
Still top 5 Pixar.
Yeah. And this film is channeling a little bit of that early on.
There's a Luca-ism to it.
Yeah, there's a Luca-ism to it. Yeah.
That makes it sound like a disease when you say it that way, a Luca-ism.
I mean, depending on which part of the country, it is a disease.
Oh, gosh.
Unfortunately so. But I do love that the film is trying to suggest that this type of platonic affection, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, maybe there's an argument to be made that male friends should depict that level of affection more often.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that it's, there's a wedge driven because of social norms and societal expectations. And then enter hockey and how it's a part of that conversation, for better or worse, mostly for worse.
There is a deconstructionist mentality to this movie
100%.
that is certainly
100%.
there. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, let's get to final thoughts. Brendan, do you have any concluding thoughts here on Close?
I will say, despite any still lingering reservations I have about the movie, maybe they'll change on a rewatch. If there's one thing that I have no reservations about, and we'll echo this once again, it is Eden Dambrine's performance.
So good.
The second we see him cast in another movie, I will be first in line because it really is one of the great child performances of the past maybe decade, honestly. I mean, there's a lot of competition there for sure, and a lot of different types of performances, but the fact that it is almost wordless, at least wordless in the scenes where in any other movie it wouldn't be wordless, but here I'm glad that it is. It's cathartic and loud in very different ways, but it is a very good performance, and that's the most rewarding aspect of it for me. I'm not too familiar with writer and director Lukas Dhont. I haven't seen Girl, the previous film that he did. Yeah, so I can't speak to that one. If any of our listeners were curious about how we felt about it, I'm curious to check up on it, though. I've heard decent things about it, but I do think this is a film I'll probably like more if I give it a second chance. I don't expect to give it that second chance anytime soon, but I still do really like it. I think it has a lot of rewarding aspects that are provocative and challenging and quite honest. I appreciate that. So yeah, I think it's a good movie. Won't be for everyone. I think it is very heavy, but I'm glad I saw it.
Yeah, I think it is very good. As I get into my final thought here, I do want to talk a little bit more about Leo and what we see with him in the back half of the film as he's exploring not just his grief, but this intrigue as to maybe what happened, what drove these decisions. There's a couple of times where he goes to visit Remy's house. Specifically, he goes to visit Sophie a few different times because he has some questions. There's this lingering intrigue as to what happened, to maybe just be in the presence where it all went down. Maybe there's something about it that would give him closure. And God, you know how I love that. And I do.
I joked about it earlier, but yeah, that is your favorite movie theme.
I do love it. It's certainly one of my favorites. And I do think that's ultimately what Leo is looking for here, is a little bit of closure.
Yeah.
And part of that closure comes with admitting his part of what happened, because there is an element that Sophie's mother doesn't know. For the questions that Leo has to Sophie, there's certainly questions that Sophie has to Leo as well. And there's a little bit of a tug of war because neither of them, or at least Leo, isn't willing to submit to that process because of fear, perhaps any sort of retribution that could come about. Eventually, that all does come to a head. It's interesting to see the initial reactions to it. I think there's credence to how they both would, react the way they do. And then, as I noted, we get to that moment in the woods there at the end. So the film, I think, builds to it in this really great way, because even as they are searching for this closure, it is done with great subtlety, with incredible reflection that is really poignant. So for as heavy as this film is, I don't think it's as weighty as, from scene to scene, it's not this cumbersome process.
Yeah, it's heavy, but it's never melodramatic, for one thing.
No,
and that would have certainly heightened the heaviness, maybe a bit too much, but it never falls into that trap.
I agree. And I think the subtlety is a big factor in why that's the case. So sure. I do really like this film. And in addition to Dhont's storytelling, his direction, I think it's a well shot movie. There are some really beautiful images here at times.
Not too loud with it either. It's kind of natural and sort of organic in a way that I appreciate it too.
I agree. I think it's well edited, especially the hockey scenes. The hockey scenes are really well edited and choreographed.
They're pretty visceral. That's why we joked about it, that this is actually a very good hockey movie. It really is.
It really is. And it taps into a broader discourse in terms of hockey and male toxicity and masculinity. That is a big talking point in the hockey world. And this film unexpectedly kind of is a contributor to that discourse. So so it's really fascinating. I do really like it. It is one of my favorite films of last year, and who knows, maybe over time it climbs the ranks for me. At the very least, I do urge people to go and see it. It didn't quite crack my top 5 for best international film, but probably my 6th. Is probably my 6th, so I have no problem with it being
pretty stiff competition.
It was
for international films in 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is to say, I have no issue with its Oscar nomination. Well deserved as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Let's not get into that conversation just because it wasn't in your top 5. Then I'm like, why did it get nominated? That sucks. Exactly. We're not in that game.
Yeah, absolutely. At any rate, if you want to continue this conversation, I do have some thoughts up at Letterboxd. You can find us there at letterboxd.com/InSessionFilm. Brendan, are you a coffee drinker?
You know it. I feel like in this profession, we need to be coffee drinkers. It's kind of a requirement.
It's a requirement, especially if you have kids, because they drain the life out of you. And I
can't relate to that notion yet, but I too am an active coffee drinker. I know you are as well.
Absolutely. And that's why we need to talk about Coffee Cult, because Coffee Cult sources only specialty grade Arabica coffee beans from over 50 countries around the world.
Yeah.
They inspect each bean and only select the highest grade. So the quality is unmatched. They are making the Ferraris of coffee.
It's ethically sourced, and it also tastes really good. And for those of us, we love our coffee. It's all about that taste. It needs to taste a certain way, and this one does.
And what's also great is they roast to order. So they don't just roast a bunch of coffee and it's sitting in some warehouse and they just send you what happens to be sitting there. No.
Yes.
They wait for your order to come in. It is roasted and then shipped to you within a few days.
Yes.
So when it arrives at your house, it is incredibly fresh.
Yes.
It is the freshest coffee you can have.
It's so fresh, and it's convenient to you as the consumer of coffee.
Yes.
But what's great about this platform is that it only sources coffee from farms that actually pay its workers, and especially women, and it pays them all fairly and equally. So it goes back into how ethically
that's a big part of it.
This product is.
Absolutely. Ethically sourced, only selecting the highest grade possible. So again, we're talking about the Ferraris of coffee. We're not talking about low grade coffee.
Everyone wants a Ferrari.
Exactly. So this coffee, it tastes great. They have single origin coffees available, various blends for you to try, and you can get 15% off with our code. So if you go to coffeecult.com, select your great Ferrari coffee.
Yes.
at checkout, use the code ISF. That is code ISF. Get 15% off. This is the best coffee you will ever try. Yeah. It is fantastic. The Sumatra is one of my favorites. The Brazil, also very, very, very good.
Oh, man, I'm thirsty now, man. You can't do this late for me.
I know. If it wasn't so late, I'd be drinking as we're doing this. But at some point, I got to sleep tonight.
Yeah.
But it's really great. Go check them out again. That's coffeecult.com. At checkout, use the code ISF and get 15% off.
And if you have more to offer with regard to the movie Close, you can also email us at InSessionFilm@gmail.com or leave us some further thoughts on our Facebook page at facebook.com/InSessionFilm. You can also tweet us at InSessionFilm or on Instagram. Our handle there is also at InSessionFilm. And once again, our email, InSessionFilm@gmail.com. If you have some long form thoughts, we tend to be long-winded here. If you are as well, join the long conversation.
Absolutely. And as we promised, that's it. That's the whole episode. There's no more.
Just think about this for a second. We had an in-depth conversation like we usually do, and the final episode is less than an hour long.
Pretty crazy, eh?
Wow. Pinch me. Am I dreaming?
It's pretty wild. I know it's new. It's new for our listeners for sure. But that's why I'm excited. We could get together for an hour during the week and... that's it. It's a good time saver for me.
We're giving them direct bookmarks to all this stuff.
I know.
So,
I love it.
So hopefully they enjoy it.
I hope so as well. Any final thoughts before we get out of here for this episode?
I will just say be on the lookout for our next main show episode because we've got a lot more Shyamalan to talk about.
We do.
So, I have not seen Knock at the Cabin yet. I'm not sure if you have yet. What is it with Shyamalan? I know when I go into one of his movies nowadays, I might not be going into one of my favorite movies of the year, but I'm always excited to see it. I
agree. Like I'm always intrigued to see what M. Night Shyamalan is up to next. I don't know much about the novel it's based on either, so
neither do I.
We'll see. But stay tuned. Episode 520, we'll talk more about M. Night Shyamalan. And we'll have some more reviews coming down the pipeline very soon, including the aforementioned latest from M. Night Shyamalan. So stay tuned for all of that. We will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Go see Close. It's good.
Cheers.
It's good.
Cheers.